So what I'm going to do now, just very briefly, is to talk about compliance and ethics programs. And it's a fairly complex topic in the sense that there's lots to talk about in terms of what an element is or what the elements are of an effective program and exactly how you create one and how you satisfy all the elements. So what we're going to do today is a very abridged version of that. It's more of a public service announcement just to introduce you to the concept of a compliance program and why it's necessary. So just by way of background, I've been helping companies create their compliance program since about 2005 when I did my first program. And that was for a company that I worked for. I joined after they had experienced a global antitrust issue, price fixing issue. So naturally, they were interested to develop a program. And at that time, we're still talking about cases like Tyco and Enron that were these big scandals in the news that motivated people to think about compliance and ethics programs as a method of protection. For many companies, especially private companies at that time, compliance programs were considered a luxury in some cases, but in across the board, people at private companies thought that they were virtually optional. You know, it was a nice to have and not a requirement. As time has gone on in the last 15 years, that has definitely changed. Um, Certainly when you talk about government contractors, having a compliance program in place is mandatory in many cases. And for very small contractors that might barely escape the requirements in the procurement regulations, it's definitely it's definitely something that is becoming mandatory quite often by contract. Because what you'll find is that even if you're small enough to avoid some procurement regulation that would require you to have have a program in place, your prime contracts, the subcontracts you have with your prime are going to flow down requirements to have a program in place, to have a legally effective program in place. So again, the discussion that we'll have today will introduce you to those issues and then exactly how it works for your company, what's required, how it fits and how you create the program is something that's a bit more case specific and we can talk about, one-on-one. So the legal and regulatory background, as I said, there are many regulations at the agency level that require federal contractors to have programs, to have effective compliance and ethics programs in place. By the way, when I talk about compliance in this context, I'm not talking about specific regulatory compliance like you would find, let's say, in the FDA regulations, where a pharmaceutical company has got very specific regulations. Financial services is another example of a highly regulated business. When I say compliance in this context, I'm thinking about general ethics, compliance with the law generally. And then, of course, when you talk about federal contracting, we want to be sure that we're complying with the procurement regulations. There's also Department of Justice guidance here that I think is very interesting and very helpful. You know, one of the reasons that a company would want to have a program in place is to have what I think about as an insurance policy in place. DOJ prosecutorial guidance indicates that prosecutors can decide not to charge companies in certain cases or to have deferred prosecution agreements or non-prosecution agreements with companies that have got a legally effective program. Because the thought there is that the company has done what it can to avoid legal violations by its employees. And to the extent it might happen, it's either accidental or it's because of the actions of a rogue employee. So prosecutors have a lot of discretion to basically go easy on companies that have got legally effective programs in place and are doing their best to make sure that those programs are updated and active. So you're basically not only complying with your regulatory and contractual requirements by having a program, but you're also buying yourself some peace if you find yourself in trouble. I say that it overlays with employee relations because a compliance program really dovetails with how you work with your employees and what kind of requirements you have with them, how you manage those people. Because you basically need to, for lack of a better word, you need to flow down these compliance and ethics concepts to your employees. You need to train them. You need to make them understand why compliance is really important and how it's critical to your business. And the way that you do that is quite often by partnering with your human resources folks. Here's an area that I think a lot of companies fall down on. You'll see in a minute when we look at the list of elements that where you start from is having policies and procedures in place. You know, you have a code of ethics or a handbook about ethics in place, and you can do all of the documentary things that you need to do, but quite often companies fall down on their risk assessment responsibilities because the law is going to require us to have not only documents in place and training in place, but maybe just as importantly, to take the time to assess risk within your organizations, to spend the time with your employees and your executive team to understand what the risk is in your particular company, identify the risk areas that you face, and come up with you know, a prioritization of those risk areas, and start working on them. You know, do what's called remediation, fix those issues, either recognize that they're there and get rid of them, manage them in some way, buy insurance for them, etc. So the name of the game is assessing what the risk is and fixing it, or dealing with it in a meaningful way within the company. And again, that's where a lot of companies fall down. So here are the elements of an effective program, just really summarized at a high level. Number one, you need to have policies and procedures in place to tell employees what the rules of the road are. Quite often we do that in a handbook, or we add a handbook on top of more specific policies so that employees have a reference tool and a summary of what their requirements are. Number two is having a chief compliance officer or a senior leader in place that's going to lead the compliance program. That person should be someone who's got authority within the organization to speak directly to the board of directors if that is necessary. And the reason you want that is so that even the executives within the company are going to be subject to the rules of the road, and you have somebody who can address failings by the executive team. You need to have somebody that can reach out to the board of directors without having to go through the executives who might be the ones that are creating the problem. Number three is education and training. You need to tell employees and explain to them how the rules of the road or the policies apply to them and what they need to do to follow them. What we tell clients is that, you know, having a live training program is really helpful where you can do it, so that you've got somebody standing in front of the room explaining to people what applies to them and answering questions as you go. That may not be so easy for many companies, especially if you have remote offices, or, you know, in the current situation with COVID-19, it's certainly not an option for many companies. So companies use a combination of live training and online resources. Some of them are out of the box. You know, some of them are vendors that can give you general training segments. A lot of our clients call on us to partner with HR and create training programs that are tailored to their particular businesses. You know, and some combination of all of those things I think works for most. Number four is reporting. You need to have a system in place that enables employees and your business partners, you know, outside the company, to report concerns about ethics violations or ethics risks, to discuss concerns that they have, and to get assistance with those. You know, the reporting mechanism that many companies use, especially larger companies, is to have a hotline in place, a phone number that people can call and speak to a live representative, or have an email system in place, even a text message system. One of the things you need to keep in mind is that there needs to be an anonymous option, meaning that people don't have to identify themselves when they use that resource. And that you can understand why we have that. That's because some people feel that they're subject to retaliation if they report or they discuss compliance concerns, especially when it applies to their superiors. So you want people to feel comfortable to raise the issue without fear of retaliation. And one of the policies, by the way, to go up to the first item on the list in terms of policies, is to have a very strong and clear anti-retaliation policy, so that managers understand that they can't retaliate against their subordinates, and even subordinates can't retaliate against their peers for reporting a compliance concern. Monitoring and auditing was what I was just talking about. You know, this process that is an ongoing one, not just a one and done, but an ongoing process to monitor risk of compliance violations within your company, to work with your auditors in that respect too, to the extent that you're using accountants to do your audits on an annual basis, but to spend time talking to your executives and your rank and file to understand what they see in their day-to-day work, assess the risk that there might be a compliance violation. And then once we identify what all those risks are, we rack and stack them. We rank them based on severity and probability. And that enables the management team, in conjunction with the chief compliance officer, to come up with a remediation plan. So you monitor, you audit, and then you prioritize, and then remediate. Consistent enforcement is really important. You know, when we think about enforcement of these I guess violations of the rules, if you will, is that you need to consistently enforce it top to bottom within the organization. The CEO needs to live by the same rules as someone at the lowest level of the organization and everyone else in between. So the tone, you know, this idea that that the entire company is subject to the program is, you know, called tone at the top. It needs to come from the CEO, but the CEO needs to be as subject to these rules as anyone else in the company. And you need to apply them. You need to apply them with consistency, so that person A, when they violate one of these compliance rules, is going to get the same treatment as person B. And that's another place where it dovetails into the human resources area. You want to be sure that you're not treating people differently for the wrong reasons, because there's favoritism, or and also what you want to avoid is disparate treatment of people who are in protected classes as well. And then lastly, prompt responses. You know, when a compliance concern is raised, it needs to be dealt with on a prompt basis by the chief compliance officer and the organization in general. So you need to look at each of these reports. You need to investigate them where you can, you know, and exactly how you respond is going to depend on the severity of the report and how much information that you have. But again, you want consistent approaches to these things to be sure that you're dealing with it on a prompt basis and you're dealing with it on a consistent and regular basis. So again, this is the last slide on compliance and ethics. But again, I want to just say that this is really just a very high level exposure to this topic. And exactly what an organization should do to create a program and implement it is going to depend on the size of the company, the resources, and the nature of the business. But the takeaway here is that you need to have a program if you're going to be a federal contractor, for sure. And I would tell you that even if you decide that your company is not right for federal business, having a compliance program in place is going to be something that you not only want to have, but you may be required to have by virtue of your other private business relationships as well.